There seems to be a trend, more common among Japanese publishers, where companies don't care if you can't play their games. For the longest time, Atlus only released their games on consoles and handhelds, so if you're a fan of the Megaten series and you want to play most of these games, you basically need to emulate them. No one's gonna pay these crazy eBay prices. Once Sega acquired Atlus, these games started seeing more widespread releases, specifically on PC. But then you look at Vanillaware, whose games are published by Atlus, and their releases are still locked to consoles. Unicorn Overlord released this year. Are we going to be forced to play it on Switch emulators in 20 years? I mean, look at Muramasa Rebirth. It's still locked to the Vita, and the Vita emulator barely works. With Square Enix, they're very inconsistent when it comes to making their games available. The Last Remnant was pulled from Steam and never re-added after the remastered version released. Adventures of Mana is only available on cell phones and the Vita, so that's going to be a nightmare to play in the future. And Valkyrie Profile got a port on the PSP, then a mobile remaster years later, and try playing a platformer with touch controls, it's rough. And then a PS4 port several years after that, but the PS4 port doesn't use the updated portraits from the mobile release. It's a port of the PSP version. How lazy can you be? And there's still no PC port, even though Square is no stranger to re-releasing their older games on PC. But the biggest travesty is that Valkyrie Profile 2 has been stuck on the PS2 for nearly 20 years, and the only way to play it short of busting out your old PS2 that spits out disc readers is to emulate it. And as great as emulation is these days, it still has problems. Valkyrie Profile 2's performance on an emulator has seen plenty of improvements throughout the years, but there are still some issues. The frame rate dips at the start of battle, which makes the voices lag.
Will peace ever come?
There's bad pixelation and blurring all over the place if you try to upscale the visuals, but it still looks blurry even if you play at the native resolution. Square never provided any official reason for why they won't port Valkyrie Profile 2, but considering how much of a nightmare it's been getting this game to function on an emulator, and Square has a history of losing the source code for their games, I can only assume they don't think it's worth a hassle. They'd rather Tri-Ace continue to milk the Star Ocean series instead. But it's worth whatever hassle you need to put up with, because Valkyrie Profile 2 is a one-of-a-kind experience. It's from an era where developers were more interested in experimenting with unique ideas. It's a sequel that changed just enough to feel fresh, but there are enough similarities to the original to still appeal to fans of the first game. You don't see well-known, big-budget studios making games like Valkyrie Profile 2 these days because modern publishers don't want to take chances anymore. That's why you see FromSoft making so many iterations on the Demon's Souls formula. Zelda became open world because that's the red-hot genre right now. And there are countless Assassin's Creed and Far Cry-style checklist-type games. How do you pitch something like Valkyrie Profile 2 to modern publishers? It's a side-scrolling platformer, but it's also a 3D action RPG, but it's also real-time with pause. I don't know, why don't we just reboot the series as a generic action RPG instead? Oh, that didn't work? Oh well, we tried. Back to hibernation for another decade. But during the PS1 and PS2 era, developers weren't afraid to experiment. Sometimes it was a miss, like Racing Lagoon. Having a racing JRPG sounds really cool until you actually play it, and realize that instead of grinding for levels, you're grinding the same races over and over for car parts. Sometimes, the experimentation paid off. Shadow of the Colossus showed that you could create an engrossing giant map with nothing but bosses populating it. Grim Grimoire proved that a real-time strategy game could be played with a controller. So there are still some small developers taking risks these days, but not many. I brought up Vanillaware earlier, but it's worth going into a bit more detail because they're one of the few remaining traces of the good old days. They're more interested in exploring new ideas than they are in creating sequels. It's a small studio with most of the staff made up of artists. These guys are passionate about the projects they work on, to the point where the company's president has to personally fund their games when the budget runs dry. Every single game Vanillaware has produced brings something interesting to the table. They found their niche, and they stuck with it all these years, never chasing trends, just creating games that they want to make. Tri-Ace shares a somewhat similar passion. The company's president has served as a programmer for most of their games, which explains why, from the beginning, Tri-Ace has focused on creating really interesting battle systems more than anything else. With Valkyrie Profile 2, Their plan was to take the formula from the first game and just throw in a bunch of new ideas because they sounded cool. This wasn't some focus-tested product designed to appeal to as many people as possible, and the result is a mechanically rich game that rewards players that put in the time to understand how everything works. The first Valkyrie Profile was a 2D game in both exploration and combat. The sequel keeps that 2D approach to exploration, but combat takes place on 3D battlefields. The core battle mechanics are the same, chaining attacks to juggle enemies, but this extra dimension brings a new flavor to combat, movement and positioning. This turns Valkyrie Profile into somewhat of a strategy game, something the series would double down on with Covenant of the Plume. When you look at the strategy genre, movement is a resource you use to get into position. I could talk about Covenant of the Plume, but to make this easier to understand, let's look at games you've probably played like XCOM or Fire Emblem. The strategy comes from finding the best way to position yourself in a way that benefits both attacking the enemies and defending against them. Valkyrie Profile 2 functions in a similar way. You're dashing across the battlefield using a resource to do so, to both dodge attacks and get into position. But Valkyrie Profile 2 is not turn-based, it's real-time with pause, so maybe a more appropriate comparison would be Valkyria Chronicles. There are still player and enemy phases like in Fire Emblem, but enemies can attack on your turn while you're moving. And it's the same deal, you're using a limited resource to get close enough to enemies to consistently land headshots, while also ending your turn behind cover so you don't get killed during the enemy phase. Valkyrie Profile 2, however, does something special when it comes to offense because it's not something as simple as getting close enough to land headshots or matching up a weapon triangle like in Fire Emblem. In Valkyrie Profile 2, combat revolves around destroying body parts. I've always been a fan of destructible limbs in games, not just because it's satisfying to tear an enemy apart, but because it can serve a functional purpose. Breaking limbs alters an enemy's behavior. If you break their weapon, they'll find a new way to attack you, and sometimes their new attack is much more dangerous. Sometimes a body part will be very resistant to attacks, so you need to maneuver around the enemy to locate its weak point. But the best part of this destruction is how it feeds into other systems. You want to shred these enemies into pieces because they drop accessories, and these are how you learn new skills. Each piece of equipment is color-coded and has a symbol, and when you chain these colors and symbols together into specific combinations, you unlock skills, which give you passive benefits in battle. But even if you're not learning new skills, each accessory gives a small stat boost, which is magnified if you chain the colors together. Not only that, shops carry a limited inventory, but their stock increases when you sell equipment, so you want to rip off as many parts as possible and then use those accessories to learn skills, and then sell everything to get better gear. These systems all feed into one another, and it's so refreshing to see an RPG where you can't just waltz into a new town and buy out all the best weapons right away. You need to earn your gear by performing well in battle. And you can buy and sell in bulk. This should be a default feature in every game. But even outside of combat, there's plenty of depth. Valkyrie Profile is one part action game and one part platformer. The platforming puzzles have been toned down from what you'd find in the first game, but what's here is still interesting. You can fire a crystal shot, and while in the first game you used these to create ledges and floating platforms, here you use it to switch places with enemies. It's a simple system to understand, but it's incorporated really well. You gotta lure enemies into strategic locations or buffer jumps so you can gain some extra height after you switch places. And sometimes you'll enter these zones that disable your crystal shots, so you've either gotta fight all the enemies in your way or try to find different ways around them. This bridge collapses if you jump on it, which drops you into this void zone, but if you fall in just the right spot, you can find some treasure. And like the first game, some of these are trapped just to keep you on your toes, so the game rewards exploration. And if you're afraid of leaving the dungeon before you found every treasure, the game has this handy counter on the map screen that keeps you updated. And as you're exploring, you'll come across stray weapons, which is how you acquire new party members. In the first game, recruiting Einhander was the main focus. You'd recruit them through these story scenes that explain how they died, then Lenneth would take them into dungeons to level them up and send them into Valhalla. In this game, Einhander aren't really significant when it comes to the story because there's a larger main cast this time around. But story members like to leave your party, and the Einhander system is designed to patch in the holes in your team whenever someone leaves. Or, if you really like using them, you can just have nothing but Einhander the entire time. The ones you acquire are randomized, but you can save scum to get the ones you want, even though that's not really the point. It's much more fun to just work with whoever you get. Some recruitments are fixed characters, but most pull from a pool of 2 or 3. Each one is unique, and if you bring certain combinations into battle, they'll interact with one another.
I made a mistake last time. Never again.
I beat you because of the vagaries of fate.
They don't have the in-depth backstories of the characters from the first game, but on the plus side, you're not watching protracted cutscenes whenever you recruit them. And as much as I love the first game, replaying it is a little difficult because you can't skip these recruitment scenes, and when you've played the game 4 or 5 times, you just start wishing for a skip cutscene button. Each Einhander also has different stats and attacks, so there's a reason for using them beyond just liking their character portrait. Attacks have different properties. Some lift or push enemies away, some inflict status effects, some come out slow, and you can reorder these attacks. This is important because if you have a bad attack order or just button mash, you can whiff attacks which waste your action points, and some attacks are better than others for reaching certain body parts you want to break. If you chain enough attacks together, you can use a Soul Crush, which is sort of like a limit break, but unlike limit breaks, and unlike the first Valkyrie Profile, you can skip the animations instead of being forced to watch them every single time. And if you're really good at juggling enemies, you're rewarded with bonus crystals, which increases your experience gain at the end of a battle. So it's a system designed to punish and reward you based on your skill level. You'll also find orbs in the dungeons called Seal Stones, which provide buffs and debuffs for that specific dungeon, but there are some unique spins on this system. These buffs and debuffs can affect the enemy, so when you enter a new dungeon, you can see something like increased fire damage, but it only applies to the enemy attacks. Once you get far enough in the dungeon, you'll find that Seal Stone, and not only can you remove it to take away the enemy's buff, you can hold onto it to buff your own fire attacks. And when you leave a dungeon, these stones reset, but if you pay a cost, you can save that Seal Stone for use in other dungeons. And because every system in this game is tied together, this cost is paid with the crystals you earn from juggling enemies. The better you perform in battles, the more Seal Stones you'll be able to restore. What's great about this feature is you can interact with it however you like. If you want to ignore it, you can. If you don't want to save Seal Stones for later, you don't need to. If you want to view these as puzzles to weaken the enemies and make the bosses easier, go for it. And just as a brief aside, you can refight the bosses in this game however many times you like, either for experience or to break off their parts for gear. You don't need to go into New Game Plus to refight your favorite bosses, but there is New Game Plus if you like that feature. It goes up to New Game Plus 50, and it gets harder each time. Since Valkyrie Profile 2 release, fans have been expecting a third game to round out the series as a complete trilogy. Covenant of the Plume was a nice addition, but it didn't really feel like a proper follow-up. I never really wanted a Valkyrie Profile 3 because, well, we technically got it. It's called Resonance of Fate. Same director as Valkyrie Profile 2, in fact, a lot of the same staff worked on it. You've got the side-scrolling town, part destruction, crafting from broken parts, juggling enemies, Seal Stones make a comeback, direct assault is there, and it even goes up to New Game Plus 10. The customization isn't as complex, but there are still enough unique elements here, like you can staple all these ridiculous parts onto your handguns to make them more powerful. It's a bit of a shame that there's no platforming, which is really the only thing keeping it from being a full-blown Valkyrie Profile successor, but it's pretty close. And it's an incredible game that you can actually play on Steam and modern consoles. And of course, Valkyrie Elysium. You know, I don't hate the game. It's not made by Tri-Ace, so it's easy to just dismiss it as fanfiction because that's exactly what it is. But the issue with Elysium is that it includes all these half-hearted attempts to try and make it like Valkyrie Profile, but they're just that, half-hearted attempts. There's part destruction somewhat, I think only for dragons, but it doesn't feed into learning new skills or acquiring gear because most monsters don't have destructible parts. Einhander returned, but you don't have a choice in creating a team because you only get 4, and their depth has been reduced to straightforward elemental affinities. You don't actually get to control them either. The photon and crystal puzzles have been removed in favor of simplistic obstacles that you don't even need to think about. And the combat doesn't really have any sort of strategic depth. Just use the element that the enemy is weak against. Sometimes they're weak to a weapon type, basic stuff. It's playable, but there's nothing really interesting about the game. It's as bland as it gets. And with that, it seems like we reached the end of the line for this series, at least for now. Square doesn't really care all that much about Valkyrie Profile these days. If they did, they wouldn't turn it into a failed gacha, or hand the property to a studio that had no intention on making a proper Valkyrie Profile game, which is why it's not called Valkyrie Profile. It may be difficult for this game to gain any attention these days because you basically need to emulate it, but the same can be said for countless games. How else are you supposed to enjoy games like Parasite Eve or Einhander? If Square doesn't want to port these older games to PC, or in the case of Parasite Eve, can't port it because of licensing issues, that's fine. We've got ways to play them anyway. We're very fortunate to have people that care about preserving these games more than the people that produce them. There are plenty of incredible games out there, just like Valkyrie Profile 2, that will slowly be forgotten about because companies like Nintendo and Sega are trying to stop you from playing them. But when these same companies want you to subscribe to their services to access these older games and make it so you can no longer own anything, we're not really left with much of a choice.